My name is Bill Lockhart. And this is a story of my experiences as an aircrew member on an aircrew during World War II. Seven Steps to Sagan. This is a story of what happened to me. Sagan is the name of a small town in eastern Germany, which is now part of Poland. At Sagan was located Stalag Luft III, which actually means prisoner of war camp, Air Force. While I was a prisoner of war, I put together a book in pictorial form of some of the things that actually happened to me over a period of some 5 years in the Air Force. My career in the Air Force began at Moffett Field in June of 1941. After having spent some 2 years in the Civilian Conservation Corps, I enlisted in the Air Force and went to Moffett Field for training. I had an unusual experience of having Jimmy Stewart, the movie actor, instruct me in basic training as a new recruit at the base there. After finishing boot camp at Moffett Field, I went to Santa Ana, California for pre-flight. At Santa Ana, we received instruction in close order drill, in the use of sidearms, and it was at Santa Ana at pre-flight where tests were given to determine where one might best be suited as a member of an air crew. After going through rather extensive tests, it was determined by my instructors that I would be best suited as a bombardier on an air crew. Leaving pre-flight at Santa Ana, I went to Albuquerque, New Mexico for advanced bombardier training. At Albuquerque, we had extensive ground school as well as flying instruction with practice bombing for some 4 months of training. Upon completion of my training at Albuquerque, I was commissioned a second lieutenant in the Air Force. And as it was often said by some of the other officers, we were made officers and gentlemen by an act of Congress. Upon graduation from Albuquerque, I was assigned to a B-17 crew and went to Blythe, California for my first phase of training. It was here that the crews were made up, the men that we would be flying with during the course of our career. In Blythe, we became acquainted with the plane that we would be using, which was a B-17 Flying Fortress. None of the crew, upon arriving at Blythe, had ever flown in a 4-engine airplane. So this was a new experience for the pilot, the co-pilot, myself, the navigator, and the other 6 crewmen on the ship. During this phase of training, we flew as a single crew on individual missions. After some 2 months of training at Blythe, we were transferred to Pio, Texas, and it was at Pio that we began to do formation flying, flying 3, 6, in formations of 3 to start with, and then formations of 6, and then later flying in formations of 18 planes, which would be the formation we would be using when we started flying combat overseas. From Pio, Texas, we went to Puebla, Colorado for additional training, and it was at Puebla that we started doing high altitude flying and high altitude bombing, because this actually would be the area in which we would be doing most of our combat work when we arrived overseas. After finishing our phase training at Pueblo, we went to we went to Salina, Kansas to pick up our new airplane, and from there we flew to Bangor, Maine for refueling, and then we flew to Gander, Newfoundland, which was a hopping off place to fly the Atlantic for our combat station in England. At Gander, we spent some 2 weeks waiting for favorable weather conditions before we could fly the Atlantic. The overwater flight really taxed the range of a B-17 at that particular time, and we had to wait until we had favorable tailwinds so that we could make the flight, so that we would have enough fuel to make the flight to England. This particular picture here is a rather comical drawing of the flight over the Atlantic. Some of the articles you see, perhaps can see, in the picture were things that were in very short supply in England. These were things that we were instructed by fellows who had been over there ahead of us to take with us to make us very popular with the girls once we arrived there. Yeah. An interesting thing happened to us during our flight from Gander, Newfoundland, over to England. We were just about halfway across the Atlantic when we developed engine trouble in one of the 4 engines. At this particular time, the pilot was taking a little nap, and the co-pilot was doing the flying. When the co-pilot feathered the prop, this changed the noise of the plane, and it woke the pilot up. And he's thinking, or being somewhat asleep, came to the aid of the co-pilot and feathered an additional prop on one of the other engines. With only 2 engines running at the time, we began to lose altitude rather quickly, but fortunately the engine was restarted, and we flew the rest of the way to England on 3 engines. It goes without saying that nobody slept on the cruise the rest of the way. because there were at one time during the flight we thought that we might have to throw all of our luggage overboard along with much of the equipment in order to lighten the ship enough to complete the flight without running out of fuel. This is a picture of the nose of a B-17, which is the ship that I flew in. These are the 4 officers on the crew, and in addition to the 4 officers, there are 6 other crew members, and they were staff sergeants. There was a flight engineer who was also the top turret gunner. The flight engineer was responsible for the mechanical operation of the ship, as well as being a gunner once we got to combat. There was a radio operator who also operated a machine gun that protruded from an upper open hatch in the radio room itself. There were 2 side gunners, a ball turret gunner, and a tail gunner. My position on the crew, if you look at the picture, was up in the nose, just inside the plexiglass covering. You can see the bomb sight with the wires coming down out of it. That was my position on the crew. The navigator's position, who was the only other crew member in the nose, was behind a window just above the name of the ship, as you can see. This is the window that actually provided some of the light that he used in going over his maps and navigating the plane to where we might be going at that particular time. You'll notice the name on the ship, and in this particular instance, it's a little vulgar, but there were many different names given. I might say that until we got to England, we had not decided what we would name the ship. Actually, the ship was named by the crew itself, and after having the experience that we had with our plane flying the Atlantic, we decided that we would give it the name Feather Merchant, which I think was rather appropriate after having to feather one prop and go through what I would consider a rather hairy experience on our flight over to England. This is a schematic drawing, more or less a schematic drawing, of the different compartments on the B-17. I'll start with the nose because this is the area that I was more familiar with. In the nose are situated the bombardier, the navigator. The bombardier is in the extreme front of the ship. The tail gunner is in the extreme rear. Just aft of the bombardier navigator compartment, the nose compartment, and up to the top, you can see the pilot and co-pilot compartment. And then just behind them, you see the top turret, and this is where the flight engineer, this is his station. And he stood in flight just behind the pilot and the co-pilot. He helped to read the instruments, and also during combat when he was needed as a gunner, then he would turn around, climb up into the top turret, and he operated that as a gunner. Moving on down the ship, you go through the bomb bay section where the bombs actually were hung. That's the area, the open area there, just aft of the top turret. Moving on back is the radio room, and you'll see the radio operator seated in position there. Through the top of the plane, there was an open hatch that the hatches could be open, I should say, and there was a gun that the radio operator used from that position. Next in line is the ball turret gunner, and this is a guy who really had a view of everything that was going on. He could see. He was hanging more or less suspended from underneath the ship. And I actually can honestly say that I had more fun operating the ball turret than anything that I did on the ship, especially in doing air-to-ground gunnery practice while we were still in the United States. Moving from there back into the waist section of the plane, there are two gunners there, one on each side with guns protruded out from the side of the ship. And then on back to the tail section, the tail gunner positioned in the extreme rear. You'll notice that across the top of this particular drawing it says how to bail out of the flying fortress. There were certain bailout areas, certain escape hatches that were to be used by certain crew members in the event of an emergency, either in combat or in training. The bombardier and the navigator escape hatch was a trap door that just aft of the bombardier navigator compartment. You'll notice that it indicates on this particular drawing that the pilot and co-pilot were to bail out through the bomb bay. Of course, this could be used as a means of escape, or they could go out through the hatch where the bombardier navigator went through. Unfortunately for myself, the pilot and the co-pilot, when the time came that we had to abandon ship, did use the bombardier navigator escape hatch to bail out. Otherwise, I would have had no way of knowing just what was happening when at some later time we had to abandon ship. Also, you notice the radio operators and the upper turret gunner also were to go out to bomb bay. But in order to make an escape through this particular area, the bomb bay doors had to be open. And there's always, there could be a situation where the bomb bay doors were jammed and cannot be opened. In that event, then, of course, the pilot, co-pilot would go out, the bombardier navigator escape hatch, and the radio operator, the ball turret gunner, and the radio operator, the lower ball turret gunner, the waist gunners, and the tail gunner would have to go out either the waist windows or the door in the rear of the airplane. So there were several areas of escape, and the one that could, in some instances, would be closed off would be the bomb bay doors, and in the other escape areas, in most instances, they would be open, and you would be able to get through them. Of course, there would always be the possibility of fire, where then an escape area might be cut off. But the only areas that could very definitely be closed, and in many instances were the bomb bay doors in the middle of the ship. After arriving in England, to pick up our story from here, we went on combat duty, and we started flying combat missions out of England into France, Holland, Belgium, and Germany. Our first mission was to Antwerp, Belgium, and when new crews are being initiated into combat, or new groups, I should say, usually they are given what is considered a rather easy target for their first baptism of fire. We went to Antwerp, Belgium on our first mission, and as it turned out, it was not such an easy mission for us after all. We had the unfortunate experience of encountering a crack group of German interceptors, and out of a group of 18 planes, we lost 2 bombers on our first mission. Ordinarily, on a mission of that type, there would not be any, there would be no losses in most instances. But in this case, we had picked up a crack German interceptor group that rather worked us over pretty badly before we got back to England. This is one of the planes that I'm sure many of you will recognize. It's the P-38 Lightning. During our early days in England, when we first started flying combat, this is one of the ships that was used in escort duty. It was a very good airplane, but it was unfortunately it did not have the range to give us the escort into Germany and into areas of France. However, it should provide escort into Holland, Belgium, and some parts of France. And to Germany, no, because Germany, the distance is too far, and the T-38 didn't have the range. This is the Republic T-47. There's also an American fighter plane that was used in escort duties. A very good airplane, but again, very limited in the range that, and very limited in how much escort duty they could provide for us. During the time that I was flying combat, we didn't have fighters that had the range to give us the escort that we needed, and consequently our losses were pretty heavy until a later time in the war when the T-51 when they developed the T-51 and sent it over to Europe to provide escort for the bomber crews. This is a drawing of the plane that I flew in, and as you can see by the name on the ship, it's the name is Feather Merchant. You'll notice that there were bombs, individual bombs drawn above the name Feather Merchant and above the windows. For each bombing mission we successfully completed, we were allowed to paint one bomb on our ship. And I was on my 14th mission when I got shot down. And for each little swastika that you see above the bomb, this is the number of aircraft that we had shot down. So at the time that we were shot down, we had actually completed 14 missions and had been given credit for shooting down 2 enemy aircraft. This is a picture of an A-36, which is one of our own planes used in escort, bomber escort duty and dive bombing duty as well. You'll notice the caption in this picture, our escort over Germany. This is a Focke-Wulf 190, which was a German interceptor. These are the planes that came up and intercepted and tried to shoot us down. and this is our other escort that we had over Germany, Messerschmitt 109. This was the best German fighter developed and in extensive use during World War II. These planes used to come up to intercept us, and they would come up in as many as 15, 20, 25, 30, sometimes as many as 40 of them at a time would come up and make passes through the formation. As they would close in on us, they would do a barrel roll and turn the upside. The ship would do a roll, and as they came through the formation, they would be blasting away with their cannon. The underside of the ship had heavy armor plates, and they were exposing to us an area of the plane that would make it much more difficult to shoot them down. And I might say that it was a most frightening experience to have a half dozen or so of these planes coming straight at you at a rate of closure of something like, back in those days, of 600 miles an hour, and blazing away at cannon. And usually, when they made it pass through a formation, they'd inflict some damage, either shooting down a bomber or causing some damage that might later on cause a bomber to fall out of formation. This is a picture of a B-17 on course to a bombing target over either one of the occupied countries or over Germany. If you look to the lower left of the screen, you'll see a formation of bombers. I'm sure that this particular plane that's in close view is in formation also, and it's no doubt taken from a plane that's in front of this particular bomber here.
What was the news happening while you were in formation?
Well, yes, there were times when there were situations that developed where there wasn't necessarily enemy action that could cause problems and cause planes to crash. There were times when one plane would fly into the other through pilot error or through some mechanical failure on the plane. Some of you perhaps are wondering why formation flying. This was necessary in combat in order to concentrate firepower from a big group of planes. One plane individually did not have the firepower, and almost in every instance where a plane got out of formation, either through loss of an engine or maybe two engines, and could not stay in the formation, it was just usually a matter of a few minutes until this plane would be shot down, because the German interceptor planes would concentrate on a straggler or someone that was out of formation, and it was just a matter of usually a few minutes until the crew would have to abandon ship, because there's just no way that one bomber can hold off a number of fighter planes. You notice the black puffs of smoke in this particular picture. These are anti-aircraft shells that are exploding around the plane. The Germans were very good at shooting down planes from the ground with anti-aircraft artillery. These probably are 88 millimeter shells. This is a very unnerving situation where you had to fly through this, what we call flak. In fact, it was these shells exploding near the plane would cause air turbulence, and sometimes planes would fly together because of this, and sometimes they'd lose formation because of it. It would be so concentrated and so heavy. You could also hear the shrapnel from the shells when they exploded close enough to the plane. It would have the effect of someone throwing gravel at the side of the ship, but actually they were small bits of metal that were embedding themselves into the airplane itself. My experience was that, as I think back to those days, the fighters were flying into you, barreling in with cannons flaming away were frightening, and they did an awful lot of damage, but at least we were shooting at them. Our machine gun, we had something to do, something to really, something to keep our mind off of our precarious position. But the anti-aircraft fire was nothing that we could do anything about except to take some evasive action to try to maneuver out of it as best we could while still staying in formation. But the anti-aircraft fire was the most unnerving interference that we've had. However, I don't think it was responsible for as many planes being lost as were the fighters, interceptors themselves. This is a picture of bombs dropping on one of the targets, and as you can see from the lower part of the picture, bombs have just been released from this particular bomber, and the explosion that you see on the ground, smoke, no doubt from a bomber group that has preceded the one in which you see the bomb dropping from the plane. They are ahead of this particular group and have already dropped their bombs and are on their way back towards home. This is a Messerschmitt 109 interceptor. This is the best fighter plane that the Germans used during World War II. It was the plane that we dreaded the most because it was the most maneuverable and the hardest to knock down because of maneuverability and speed. In this particular picture here, as you can see, this plane this bomber, B-17, has just dropped his bomb and has been hit either by fighters or by anti-aircraft fire. This could very well be the picture of the plane that I was on, because my experience was that we had done on a mission that we were shot down on, which was Schweinfurt, Germany, on August the 17th, 1943. We had just dropped our bombs, and we're just making a turn, going into a turn on the homeward leg of our flight when we got hit by anti-aircraft fire. And this picture, although it is not a picture of my plane, it could very well have been, because this was the condition that we found ourselves in. Shortly after we dropped our bombs, and at the same time, or shortly after dropping and being hit by anti-aircraft fire, the pilot gave the word to bail out. We had lost one engine and the second engine was on fire. Unfortunately for myself, the same burst of anti-aircraft fire that hit our ship, part of it came through the nose and a piece of shrapnel went into my right cheek, lodging behind my left eye. someone has asked, well, how does it feel to have something of this sort happen to you? It's comparable, I think, to someone hitting you in the face with a baseball bat. This is the impact of something like being shot with being hit with a bullet, or with high velocity type of weapon. The impact of the shrapnel spun me around where I was facing the rear of the ship, and then at this time I lost the headset, so I could not hear any communication from the pilot, and he had given the order to bail out. After giving the order to bail out, from what I found out from some of the crew later, the pilot decided that since we were fairly close to Switzerland, that if the plane stayed together and we could put the fire out, that by diving, going into a dive, that maybe we could head for Switzerland and be in turn, instead of having to bail out over Germany and become prisoners of war. He called a navigator to get a heading for Switzerland, but in the meantime, the navigator was, if not the first, one of the first on the crew to bail out. In the meantime, I had I was not aware of what was going on. I was somewhat in shock from the injury that I'd suffered, and had begun to lose some consciousness. When I saw the co-pilot come down out of the pilot's compartment and go through the hatch underneath, and just after the bombardier navigator compartment, I realized that there probably were only two men left on the ship, and that was myself and the pilot, because the normal bailout procedure is for everyone to go except the pilot and co-pilot, and then the co-pilot goes next to the last, and the pilot is to be is ordinarily the last man out of the ship. So after observing the co-pilot bail out, I realized that there were only two people left, or probably would be only two people left, and I realized what was happening then. Without anyone telling me, I crawled to the escape hatch and got clear of the ship and pulled the ripcord as soon as I had fallen free of the plane. I might at this time mention that before we had gotten hit on the target, we had so much interference, so much fighter interference on the way into the target, that all the crew members had strapped on their parachutes. We used a chest-type chute with just two snap rings, and a harness that we wore all the time. But normally, we'd if the interference were not too bad, we'd just leave the ship near our position so we could reach for it and snap it into place if we needed it. But because of the unusual amount of interference that we had on this particular mission, all the crew members who could were wearing their chutes snapped on and in position. We felt if nothing else, if we should be lined up in the sights of a German interceptor, and a shell came through the window that through the front of the plane, that at least the parachute would act as kind of like a bullet. It would be a barrier to stopping a shell from German fighter planes. After clearing the ship and pulling my ripcord, on the way down, the thing that impressed me the most was the how quiet everything. There's the roar of the engines and the floating anti-aircraft cells, and the vibration in the plane from firing your own 50 caliber machine gun, and all of a sudden you're out of all the noise, and you're so high up that there's no noise. Everything is just completely quiet, except a little rustle in the parachute shroud, the shroud line, I should say. When I bailed out, I think we were at about 18, perhaps 19,000 feet. So it took quite a while to come down. And having been wounded in the ship, some of the things that took place during this particular period are a little bit hazy, because I think when I was hit in the ship, my oxygen mask was damaged, and I started losing, I started bleeding, and the blood started running down into my oxygen system. So, and I was in some state of shock. But these are, to the best of my memory, these are the things that actually took place. But I still can vividly remember how quiet everything seemed to be during the descent down in parachute. When I landed out in a field outside of a small village, and some farm boy ran up to me with a pitchfork, and at first they had been warned about air crews having to bail out, and about some of them being armed, and so he came up to me and said, "Pistol." And I had no pistol on board, or I should say that I had no pistol on me. So I held up my hands, in a gesture of surrender, to let him know that that I wasn't armed, and he didn't need to use his pitchfork. So in a matter of a few minutes, a soldier came up who apparently was on leave in this particular village, and they took me in to the Burgermeister's office, who actually in Germany was the town official or the mayor of the city. This is a small village, and from there they called the military authorities, and they came out, sent a couple of soldiers out in a car to pick me up, and took me into a larger town, and where there was a military base, and I was put in the prison there, and moved from there at night, because they apparently didn't want us to know when they moved us. They didn't want us to know actually where we were in Germany. Later that night, they came to the military stockade where I was kept, and picked me up. When they escorted me out to this truck, there were some 10 or 12 other American airmen who had been shot down apparently the same day that I was, that were being transported to apparently a central gathering point. And as I found out later, these men eventually were sent to Frankfurt to an interrogation center. Myself, needing medical attention, I was separated from the group and was sent to a prisoner of war hospital at Nuremberg. This this hospital was in downtown Nuremberg, and as I discovered when I got there, it was full of patients, most of them being victims of bombing raids that had been made on Nuremberg previous to my arriving there. I was not received very cordially at this civilian hospital they took me to. They took me into this room, a big German fellow and a hospital administrator, or perhaps a doctor in the hospital, who no doubt had lost some members of his family in a bombing mission, decided to take all of his ill feeling out on me, and he knocked me to the floor and started to stomp me, and started cursing me in German. I'm sure they were curse words, because a couple of them were, one of them was swine, which is pig in English, and Schweinhund is also a German curse word. But cooler heads prevailed, and they finally pulled him off of me, and the last I remembered was going to sleep in the operating room with a couple of young German doctors standing over me. Sometime later, I woke up in the morgue of the hospital, which was my recovery room. In fact, I don't think they could have cared less whether I recovered or not. So I ended up in the morgue to recover or whatever. After spending some time there, I was picked up by a couple of German soldiers and taken out to a prisoner of war hospital just outside Nuremberg. This hospital is located inside of a camp that was turned into a prisoner of war camp after the war started, and it was near the big stadium where the Nazi Party had their rallies every year. This particular camp was used as housing for party members when they came to the party congress every year, because there was not enough accommodation for all the people who came to these rallies. But when the war started, this was turned into a prisoner of war camp, and the hospital that I was taken to for recovery was inside this prison camp. And the doctor who took care of me, once I left the German hospital, a civilian hospital in downtown Nuremberg, was Yugoslavia. He was actually the chief surgeon in one of Belgrade's largest hospitals. And unfortunately for him, he was a prisoner of war during World War I as well as World War II. He was a man, I would say, in his 60s at that particular time. This doctor could speak 7 different languages, and I was the only American in the hospital at this particular time. And I was treated really with warm affection by the prisoners there. Being the only American, I really had unusually good treatment, because of they felt that if it were not for us, that perhaps the war would have already been over. So, needless to say, I was among friends while I was there. After spending about a week at this hospital, well, I should say the day after I arrived at this hospital, there was another American airman that was brought in. He was a gunner that was shot down the same day that I was off another crew. He was a Polish kid and could speak Polish language, which helped very much in talking to some of our attendants there in the prisoner of war camp hospital. This particular camp, as I mentioned before, I was the only American there. There were French, Russian, Polish, Yugoslavian nationalities, and before I left the camp, the Italians had surrendered, and the Germans had started taking Italian prisoners, and they were also bringing some of them into the camp. However, at this particular time, there were no Italian prisoners of war there. About a week after I arrived at this hospital, the RAF bombed Nuremberg one night. The Germans had allowed the prisoners to build air raid shelters. Actually, they were trenches they had dug and put heavy timbers over them. And when the air raid sirens sounded this particular night, all the people in the hospital, the other patients, the attendants and everybody went underground, and they left John and I topside. I couldn't quite understand this because I could walk, but John couldn't. He had a pelvic injury and could not be actually moved from his bed. So I presume that they must have left me topside to provide John with company. Well, as we found out later, there were the RAF put about 700 planes on Nuremberg this particular night, and after about an hour and a half of bombing, the sky was just as bright as daylight. There were so many fires, and the RAF dropped some bombs right near the camp where we were. In fact, they dropped one bomb about 2 blocks from the barracks that we were in, the hospital barracks, and they dropped some incendiary bombs right across the street from the building we were in, and the building caught fire and burned to the ground. It was rather a frightening experience to go through a bombing raid and be on the receiving end of it rather than up in the air on the sending end. After spending about 6 weeks at this particular hospital, I had recovered to the place where they could move me to Frankfurt, and Frankfurt was an interrogation center, and at Frankfurt, this is where they tried to get information from shot down airmen as to where they were flying, what they were flying, whereabouts they were in England, some of the characteristics of the ship they were flying. However, according to Geneva Convention, we only were required to give them our name, rank, and serial number. And in most instances, they didn't press for too much additional information. There were times when they would go beyond just pressuring, extensively questioning a prisoner, and this would be if they shot down a new plane that they didn't know too much about. Then they were very they'd try to interrogate for a longer period of time, and also would try to put a little more pressure on, especially if it, as I mentioned, if it was something that was a new plane and they perhaps didn't know too much about. But in my instance, in my situation, I should say, I was only there for about 3 days, and then from there, Frankfurt was an interrogation center, and from there, after they had interrogated a group of several POWs, they would put us in boxcars, and they took us up into eastern Germany to the POW camp where I was to spend most of the time that I was a prisoner in Germany. At this particular moment, I'd like to back up and digress a little bit from my experience in prison and tell you a little bit about this particular plane. The mission that I was shot down on, Schweinfurt, was one of the costliest missions of the war. The 8th Air Force lost some 60 planes on this mission. Out of the group that I was flying with, of 18, 12 of us were shot down, only 6 planes getting back to England. Some of the planes got back looking pretty much as this plane here did, with rather extensive damage. We talked to some of the crews that were on that particular mission and were shot down on later missions, and they told us that those who did get back from this particular mission used up all their ammunition, and most of them burned the gun barrels up on their machine guns. In operating this type of gun, you fire short bursts of and then you allow the gun barrel to cool off before you fire again. Otherwise, you burn the barrel up. And the enemy interference was so extensive and so pressing that they didn't have time to let the gun barrels cool. But this shows you what punishment the B-17 would take and still be able to fly. This ship was actually flown back from combat and landed in England, and this picture was taken at the completion of a mission. This, you might say, is more or less the beginning of my stay in Stalag Luft III. Although this is a humorous picture, it certainly wasn't a humorous condition to be in at this particular time. From here on, there will be pictures of life in Stalag Luft III. As I mentioned before, this particular prison camp was located in eastern Germany, in a little town called Sagan, which is now a part of Poland. This is a picture of myself drawn by an artist in the POW camp with us. This is a crew that I flew with. These were the men that were on board my ship when I was shot down, with the exception of Staff Sergeant Heinz, the radio operator and also radio gunner. On a previous mission, Staff Sergeant Heinz was injured and was in the hospital at the time that we were shot down. We had a substitute radio man flying with our crew on this particular day that we were shot down. The ironical part about this situation is that the man who was flying in Heinz's place was shot down with us, and our whole crew actually bailed out. No one was killed in the ship. The only man who actually suffered a combat injury was myself. The crew of the substitute radio man who was flying with us on that particular mission, of course, was shot down with us. The remainder of his crew went on to complete their tour of duty and all came back to the United States. Staff Sergeant Heinz was assigned to another crew at a later date and was killed in action on a later mission. So this is one of the ironies of war, is that it had no doubt had Staff Sergeant Heinz been flying with us on this particular day, he would still be alive today. You'll notice that the assembly, January 31, 1943, this was when our group came together and started flying as a crew. And TAPS was on August 17, 1943 when we were shot down. This is a picture of myself taken shortly after graduating from flying school in Albuquerque. And this is a picture of the same guy as a prisoner of war in Germany some 6 weeks after I was shot down. You'll notice that the scar under my left eye and the Band-Aid on my right cheek, this was some 6 weeks after I had suffered the injury. I might mention here that I did lose the use of my left eye as a result of that particular injury. You might also notice that I'm wearing actually a British flight jacket here. This was given to me because at the time I was shot down, I was wearing a flight suit, and the Germans would not permit us to keep that type of clothing. So they gave me actually an RAF flight jacket to wear. I don't know why. Their rules were that you shouldn't fly, you couldn't wear flight coveralls, but you could wear a flight jacket. This is the identification card that was on file in the POW camp, Stalag Luft III, where I was prisoner for some, well, let's see, from about October 1st, 1943 until January 1945. It's amusing to look at some of the German writing on this particular card. You'll see that the personnel cart actually means personnel chart, really. Personal chart is what they're saying. The next word is Kriegsgefangenen. This is German for prisoner of war. Samlager means the name, which actually means the name of the camp. And Stalag Luft III, Luft means air, Stalag means prison. Going on down the card, name, bore name. On the third line, there is actually my date of birth and the state that I was from, the United States. Religion, Protestant, and there's a place there for father's name and mother's name, but they weren't that concerned about who they were. In fact, they didn't even get this information. Over on the right side, USA, the rank, second lieutenant, branch of service, USAAF. Some of you who had German will probably be able to read this better than I. The next question was, what was I in civilian life? A student at that particular time, or prior to going into the Air Force. The other words I'm not sure of. I don't know that much about German. But then going on down, they had my weight at 180 pounds, blonde hair, when I had hair, fingerprint, and then who to notify in the event of emergency. But they misspelled on the third line of the address. It says Highway Village, and actually it should be Meridian, Mississippi, and they had North Gendon, which there's no such town that even exists in Mississippi. So this was the card that was made out on each POW that was in the camp that I was in. Ordinarily, we would not ever have had access to this particular card, but at the end of the war, after we were liberated, our own military forces happened to get a hold of these cards, and they returned them to us as souvenirs, of course. Otherwise, we would never seen them. They were identification cards on the POWs in the particular camp that I was in. This is a diagram of a compound in the camp where I was incarcerated for, as I mentioned before, from about October 1, 43 until January of 1945. The camp, this is one compound within the camp that I was in. I was in the central compound. This is the north compound. And from this particular compound, the Great Escape took place. This is, I'm sure many of you have read the book. I have seen the picture. I believe Steve McQueen had one of the feature roles in this particular movie. And to some extent, the movie followed what actually took place in the Great Escape. However, from my knowledge of what actually happened to the men who did escape, all but 2 or 3 of them were actually caught, and according to what the Germans had told us, they were shot. Because at this particular time, when the escape took place, was in the winter of 1944, the Germans were losing the war on all fronts. They more or less had their backs to the wall, and they couldn't, they could care less about really what happened to most prisoners of war. So in better times for them, when prisoners escaped, they would put you on solitary confinement on bread and water for 30 days, and that would be about the extent of it. But at the time that the Great Escape took place, they weren't, as I mentioned, they were losing the war and were in a rather desperate situation. So they just felt they didn't have time to be looking for escaped POWs. So about a week or 10 days after the escape took place, the German commandant came into our camp and had us all assembled and told us what had happened to those who had escaped, and warned us that anyone caught trying to escape, or anyone who, if they should escape and were caught, would be immediately shot. That they had no recourse, but this is what would happen. This is a picture of a guard tower at the camp that I was at. This is also a drawing from my book, the guard tower. Now these, in some instances, these towers had mounted machine guns, and others, the German soldiers carried a rifle. But the camp that we were in, and most of the towers were manned by machine guns, and of course they had searchlights that were used at night, where they continuously rotated around to so that the fences were illuminated. The rolled up barbed wire you see at the bottom was rather tough thing to get through. And between the fence and the inside of the camp, there was what they called a safe area, a railing around this area. And anyone who went inside of this, you never had to make it to the fence. All you had to do was go inside this restricted area, and they'd open up on you with a machine gun. They'd ask no questions whatsoever. So you didn't dare step over this particular area, let alone as much as get to the fence. But if you could ever get through the fence, you'd have a pretty tough time getting through all this barbed wire. This is an inside of the barracks where I live. It looks rather spacious in this particular picture, but in order to get all the drawing, in order to give you an idea of what was inside of one of the barracks, it's kind of scattered out somewhat as to what it actually was. When I was first shot down and went there in October of 1943, there were about 6 or 8 fellows who lived in what was called a combine. When we were eventually moved out of this camp in January 1945, there were about 16 to 18 men living in the same area. They just kept packing us in and kept putting stacking the beds up 3 and 4 high instead of 2 high. They ended up 3 and 4 high. They kept shooting down more and more airmen, and instead of building more POW camps, they just jammed them into what they already had. This is an actual photograph taken of one of the barracks, rather than the drawing that you just saw. The title of this is Just a Quiet Night in Kriegi Land. Now, when we say Kriegi, this was a kind of a short word for Kriegsgefangenen, or prisoner of war. We called ourselves Kriegi. This is the common name that was used. And this is a rather exaggerated drawing of what actually took place, but there was some horseplay, and even though we were prisoners of war, we didn't lose our sense of humor, and there were a lot of amusing things that actually went on in a prisoner of war camp. Perhaps I could stop here to tell you that the Germans did not furnish us with utensils to cook with. We had to make our own. And some of the fellows became very, very good metalsmiths at taking tin cans and making cooking pans, cups, plates, and utensils of this out of this ordinary tin can. Those were the only things that we had to eat out of, and it's amazing what you can do when with so little when you have to. This is a list of the contents of what actually came in a Red Cross package. I might pause here to say that the Germans actually did not feed us very much of their own food. However, they did allow the American Red Cross to ship in food to us in Red Cross parcels or packages. They came in by the plane loads, actually, which was, fortunately for us, sustained us pretty well through our years in prison camp. If it were not for these packages, we would have suffered nutritionally, would have fared very, very badly. You see from the contents, there was a pretty good selection of items. This package weighed 10 pounds, and the first year I was there, we got one 10-pound package of food a week. But then, the end of the second year, or the end of the first year, along about September of 1944, the German transport system began to break down, and they couldn't get the food to us, the packages to us, so we got one every 2 weeks. And then the last 3 or 4 months I was there in prison, we didn't get any, because the transport completely broke down, and the only thing we had was a very meager ration of stuff that the Germans gave us. And I might say that the last 3 months, 4 months that I was in prison, I lost 40 pounds. So it gives you an idea of how well we fared on what the Germans gave us to eat. These are pictures that were sent me from home. We were allowed to receive mail from home. We were allowed to write 3 small letters, 3 short letters, like mailograms, and 4 postcards a month. Of course, they were heavily printed. And these pictures, one of my sister on the upper left. You'll notice that on this particular page, there's 3 up in the right-hand corner, and 4 in the bottom left-hand corner. When we were moved from one camp to another, they picked up our books and censored them. And they cut out, some of the pages were completely cut out, taken out, and in this instance, they took a couple of pictures out, and I don't remember now just what they were. At that time, I knew, but after all these years, it's hard to remember just exactly what actually they took out of my book. This is Creaky Bunny. Actually, we had no money as such. In some of the camps, I suppose the Germans actually issued some kind of script, as we understand. But I was in an officer's camp, and we were locked up. We're not allowed to. We didn't have to work. Of course, we didn't want to help them in any way. But the only system that we had was kind of a barter system. And the only thing that had any particular value there was chocolate and cigarettes. However, at this particular time, there were more cigarettes than there were candy, and you can see that one bar of this chocolate was worth 150 cigarettes, or 4 to 5 points at the food Acco, which was kind of a little food store in Creegyland, which was prisoner of war land, actually. So chocolate was actually the most sought after food item in POW camp. This is a list of some of the books that I read while I was in prison. We were very fortunate in that the YMCA furnished us with reading material. They also furnished us with athletic equipment, with musical instruments. We had our own band. We had the Germans allowed us to put on plays and put on musicals. We had this was entertainment provided by musicians that were prisoners of war. That some of them actually were professionals before they went into the military. I might say while I was there, I think I read some 200 books, which is it was a good way to broaden your your thinking as well as occupy a lot of your time. And this is just a list of some of the books that I read while I was there. While I was in prison, my first son was born, and this is a letter that I got that came to me through the American Red Cross, notifying me that a son had been born. It was some 6 months. He was some 6 months old before I knew, before I was notified of his birth. While we were in prison, we were given a German, not an English language newspaper. It was actually a German propaganda newspaper written in English, and this is a picture of one of the German fighter aces that was in the German Air Force, or the Luftwaffe. And no doubt this gentleman here was responsible for many of us being in prison camp, because he was a German air ace and was credited with shooting down several bombers. This, well, of course, was a very happy occasion in the life of Krieges in camp when the invasion took place on June the 6th, 1944. This is a map actually provided by the Germans showing the Brest Peninsula and the area in which the invasion took place. I might mention here that we actually received news broadcasts in the prison camp. However, they were usually the Germans were 2 or 3 days behind the actual fighting and the front. And the reason we knew this was that we actually received broadcasts from the British Broadcasting Corporation. They came in by secret radio into one of the compounds in the prison camp where I was at. Of course, the Germans didn't know this. This was a secret radio, and we got the news actually from BBC every day, along with the news from the Germans. So this is why we knew that where the fronts were and how the fighting was going, even before the Germans passed the information on to us. There was a lot of speculation going on in the camp about how soon the war would end after the invasion took place. A lot of the fellows were so optimistic about the situation that they were making bets that we would be home by Christmas. And some of the bets were rather amusing also. One fellow had to push a potato with his nose for about the equivalent of 2 city blocks because he had lost a bet to another fellow that would be home by Christmas. And of course we weren't, because as you know, the war didn't end until 1945. So it actually took a lot longer than any of us anticipated that it would after the invasion took place. This is a map of Germany, and you can see where Sagan is in relation to Berlin. It was about 85 miles southeast of Berlin. And we actually were on a branch of one branch of the Oder River. This particular part of Germany now is actually a part of Poland. After the war, it was given back to Poland. But when the Royal Air Force bombed Berlin at night, we could hear. We were about 85 miles from Berlin, and we could hear the rumble from the bombs, and we used to call it the Berlin Symphony, because to us it was sweet music, because we knew it was hastening the day when when we would be out, the war would be over and we'd be home again. This is a forged document used that was to be used by escaped POWs. This document was prepared by the one of the escape committees in one of the POW camps. In Germany, during the war, every person had to carry papers identifying themselves, and spot checks were made at rail stations, bus depots, any place where the public might gather. These documents were checked periodically, so any POW attempting to escape in Germany had to have a copy of these documents in order to proceed very far. Now, I'm sure most of you have heard of the Great Escape. This was an escape that took place in the winter of 1944 from one of the compounds in the camp where I was a prisoner. This is a diagram of how a tunnel would actually be constructed. Looking to the right of the screen, you can see where the shaft went down from inside one of the barracks into a kind of a central location, and then going off to the left up through underground past the control towers or watch towers into the forest. In this particular one, I would assume that this would be one very similar to what was used in the Great Escape. Perhaps some of you have seen the movie, and some of you may have read the book. This is, to our knowledge, the greatest escape attempt that was made from a German prison camp during World War II. In this particular escape operation, 278 were actually prepared to escape. 78 actually got through the tunnel and outside the prison camp. 75 were eventually captured, and only 3 made it to England. And according to what the Germans told us, and evidently this is true because it came out after the war, 50 were executed. Some were taken back to prison camps. However, we were told about 3 days after the escape took place by the German commandant who came in to the compound where I was a prisoner. We all had to stand at attention out on the parade ground, the ground where they used to count us every day. And he addressed us and told us that all had been shot. He said that no more escape attempts would be tolerated, and anyone caught attempting to escape would be immediately shot. Of course, this was in violation of the Geneva Convention, but they could care less about the Geneva Convention at this particular time because they were losing the war and things were going rather badly against them, and they were in no mood to tolerate any more escape attempts. Now this is a stove, and underneath this stove is where the tunnel began. The Germans had what we call ferrets. There were intelligent fellows in blue coveralls who walked around through the camp looking for any evidence of escape attempts, such as uniforms being made or civilian clothing being made, any evidence of fresh sand, or any evidence of documents being made. They would never, if you spoke to them in English, they would pretend that they couldn't understand you. However, we knew that they could speak and understand English as well as we. But this was a guise that was put on by them to kind of so that they seemingly would carry more of a low profile. We were not allowed as individual prisoners to fraternize with these fellows in any way. There was a special escape committee that was authorized to make contact with these individuals. There were obvious reasons for making these contacts. They were human like anyone else, and by having special persons on the committee make contact with them who could speak German, because as I say, these fellows pretended they didn't understand English. They could barter with them for concessions. For example, the secret radio that was used to pick up British broadcasting news from England was actually smuggled in by one of these ferrets. So there was a special reason for designated people making contact with these individuals. Now this, just looking at this stove and the brickwork underneath, one would never suspect that from underneath here the tunnel began. But we had to be very secretive about it, because any evidence of any fresh sand or of any evidence of a tunnel being built from a particular barracks would immediately bring in what we call the goon squad, and the procedure in this was that we were counted at least 3 times a day, and sometimes more, depending on whether or not there had been recent escape attempts. If they suspected that there was a tunnel being built from a particular barracks, you'd fall out in the morning for what we call the Pell, which is just count. They didn't take roll as such. They just counted the number of prisoners. They were only interested in numbers. When you went back to your barracks, you'd be locked out. There'd be a guard contingent around the barracks, and sometimes they'd spend hours searching through the barracks for forged documents, uniforms that had been altered to look like civilian clothing, or to look for evidence of a tunnel being dug from somewhere underneath the barracks itself. So we had to be in planning tunnels and planning escapes. One had to be very secretive about it. This is a diagram of actually how the tunnels were dug and how the sand was disposed of, how it was gotten out of the tunnels. In the area where our camp was located and where the great escape took place, the soil was very sandy, which made it much easier to dig than what otherwise would have been in soil if the soil had been heavier. But in this particular area where we were, the soil was rather sandy. It got pretty hot underground in these tunnels, as one can imagine, working in such close quarters. This is an air pump that was used to pump air underground so there would be enough ventilation in the tunnel. Without these, there would not be enough oxygen to sustain the fellows as they did their digging. This is a photograph of the tunnel itself, and because of the sandy area in which the camp was located, the ground had to be reinforced because it was so sandy. So as they went along, they had to use lumber, and the lumber was taken out of places that were not obvious to the Germans that lumber had been removed, such as up in the ceiling of the barracks, and removing a bed flat here and there from the beds in the barracks themselves. The sand was, disposing of the sand was quite a problem, because sand dug from down a ways underground looks differently from sand on top of the ground. It's wet, and the texture would change from time to time. So disposing of it was presented quite a problem. This fellow here has, you see the white strings on each side of, on the right and the left of the fellow standing here. Those were long, actually were socks, and they were made in such a way that the socks were filled with sand, and there was a string attached to one end of the sock, so that by pulling this string and walking around and over a rather extensive area, the sand could be dispersed without there being evidence of a lot of fresh sand on the ground. The Germans looked, they were rather alert to this type thing, and we had to be very careful. Actually, the disposal of the sand was the most difficult thing to do, because obviously in building a tunnel of this size and of the length, there was a tremendous problem in disposing of all the sand that was dug out of the tunnel. It presented quite a problem, and the Germans were on the alert, watching for evidence of tunnel building, and the best evidence they could have would be if they could discover where fresh sand had been dumped. About a month or 6 weeks after this, the Great Escape took place, this was in January of 1945, the Russians had taken most of Poland and were within about 20 miles of the camp where we were located, Stalag Luft III. The Germans decided that they were going to move us from the camp that we were in, because if they had not done this, we would have been overrun by the Russians. We were so close to the Russian line that for several days before they moved us, the German Stuka bombers would fly over the camp, and we could see bombs hung under the wings of the Stuka bombers, and they'd only be gone for maybe 10 minutes, and they'd return empty. So we knew that the front was rather close. In addition to this, we could hear artillery fire as well, and knew that it couldn't be more than 20 or 25 miles from where we were located. We were so close to the front that the Germans dared not move us by rail that close to the front. So we had to walk out of the prison camp where we were. And this is a picture showing a long line of prisoners on the roads marching back further into Germany, so that they could bring the trains in and pick us up and move us somewhere else to a more secure area inside Germany. This picture and the three or four this drawing, I should say, and the three or four that follow, was made by a very good friend of mine. There were sketches made by him, and very vividly show what actually did happen. There's one interesting thing that I might mention at this particular time. While we were marching along the roads in the opposite direction from the front, there were the German troops with their artillery were moving up to the front. I'll never forget the scene during this particular time of these strong-looking, appeared to be crack German troops in white uniforms, because there was snow on the ground at this time. This was in the middle of winter. Moving up to the front, stopping along the road as we were marching out, asking us for Zigaretten, which is a German word for cigarette. they were very limited in the ration of cigarettes that they got, and actually we as prisoners of war, because of the Red Cross package that we received containing cigarettes, had actually more cigarettes than the German soldiers did. And I remember the remark being said by some of the prisoners as we gave them cigarettes on their way up. Poor guys, it's only a matter of days until a lot of them will be Russian cannon fodder. And we were generous in passing out cigarettes, realizing that it very well could be the last time that many of those fellows who smoked would enjoy really a good cigarette. Perhaps you're wondering why the Germans would take the trouble to move tens of thousands of prisoners back further into Germany to keep the Russians from liberating it. I think at this time they entertained the thought that they would use us as hostages in order to extract a better surrender conditions, because I'm sure at this particular time they realized that aside from a miracle that they were going to lose the war, and this is the reason that they felt it was necessary to move us back further into Germany. However, at a later date, as we understand it, Hitler gave the order that all prisoners of war to be killed. This was at a later time when the war had gotten to the point where there was they were in desperation, and they were not able to strike any particular bargain or any particular deal with the Allies other than an unconditional surrender. An interesting thing happened at our camp before we were moved and started marching us out. We had a Brigadier General Bannerman who had been shot down and was a prisoner of war, as well as several colonels. The German High Command, a few days before we were marched out of the camp, took the general and 5 or 6 colonels, as we found out later, to Berlin, and were attempting through them to contact the Allies and set up some kind of an unconditional surrender. This was strictly the Germans' idea, and the general and colonels, it was done without their approval, and of course they had no authority to negotiate with the Allies, and at a later time the Germans realized the futility of the thing, and they rejoined us at a camp at a later date, at another camp at a later date. We marched several days before we got far enough back into Germany that the Germans felt safe enough to bring their trains up and move us. So we spent this time on the road. However, it was so cold at night, the temperature was down around 0, that we stayed in different facilities where we were out of the weather and at least inside some building. This is a large church at a place called Halbau. The drawing itself doesn't necessarily give you the idea of the size of the church itself. But we stayed here for one night, and then we marched on, I believe the second day we walked all day and all night, and a third day before stopping at this barn at Ceiling Roof. These are small hamlets or villages, which is now part of Poland. We stayed 1 or 2 nights at this in this barn, and then we moved on to a pottery factory at Moscow. At this particular pottery factory, there were ovens that were furnaces that were being used, and it was warm, and it was the only place we really had the opportunity to really warm up during our march. I'll never forget. While we were at this factory, we met one of the German workers whose son had been taken prisoner in North Africa and was a POW in a camp up at Stockton. And this fellow was so happy that his son was a prisoner in the United States, because he knew that someday he would see him again. This is the other camp that we were taken to after we were moved from Stalag Luft III. We went to Stalag 7A at Moosburg, which is down near Munich in southern Germany. I might add that we didn't travel by first class passenger train. We were actually loaded into boxcars, and you might say like you would load cattle and ship them from one stockyard to another. This is about the way that we were handled. I remember at this particular time the British and U.S. Air Forces were bombing rail yards and any trains that they could locate. They were concentrating heavily on the transport system in Germany. During our trip down into southern Germany, which took some 3 or 4 days of train travel, because we couldn't. They probably had to route us around certain areas that had already been bombed and the rail lines were destroyed. We pulled into this one station and stopped, and the air raid siren started going, wailing, and immediately the train started up and pulled out of the station. No doubt this particular town that we were in was there was an air raid either in progress, or the bombers were on their way. When we got into Munich, the train that we were on pulled into the rail yards about 10 o'clock in the morning, and it sat there until 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Munich was one of the largest cities in southern Germany, and was the target of our bombers on many different missions. And there were some of the fellows who actually had bombed Munich on missions before they were shot down, and they told us that if the 15th Air Force, which is stationed in Italy, when they bombed Munich, they usually bombed sometime around the noon hour, and here we were sitting in the rail yards most of all day, but fortunately, as luck would have it, the 15th Air Force bombed other targets on that particular day. This particular camp here was not an Air Force camp. It was a regular Wehrmacht, which is the German army, was a camp run by them. But at this particular time, with the camps that they had to evacuate in eastern Germany, they were not particular about where they took us to when they got us down into southern Germany. This was the most difficult period of my incarceration as a prisoner of war in Germany. At this particular time, the war was going rather badly. The Allies across the Channel were on the borders of Germany. The German population was actually going hungry themselves, and of course, needless to say, we went hungry also. From February of 45 until we were liberated in April of 45, when the war ended, we had very little to eat. It was during this period of time that I lost some somewhere around 40 to 50 pounds of weight. It was a very, very difficult time for prisoners because of the lack of food and no fuel for fires in the building. Many times we stayed in bed with all the clothing that we owned on our backs to try and stay warm. We stayed in bed quite. There were many days that all we did was get up to get what little food was available to us, and we spent the rest of the time in bed in an attempt to stay warm. This is a camp where I was at when the war ended. We could tell some week to 10 days before we were liberated that the war was coming closer to our area. We could hear artillery. The planes flew over. American planes flew over constantly, and there was a railroad line just outside the camp, and the American fighter bombers used to fly up and down this railroad track looking for trains to shoot up. And one day they caught a train just outside our camp and blasted it to bits. As I said, we knew several days in advance that the war was coming closer, and it was just a matter of days until we would be liberated. We woke up this particular morning, and the German guards had disappeared from their posts around the camp. Of course, we couldn't. It was a rather baffling situation to us, but we soon found out why the guards had disappeared. The tanks, American tanks, showed up, and one or two of them actually came into the camp where we were. This is the most exhilarating feeling that I had ever experienced, I think, in my life. To realize that we were being liberated, and that we would soon be free men again. After the tanks arriving at the camp, they moved on down to cross the river on the way into Munich. But the Germans had blown this bridge up across the river. However, it was only a matter of about an hour until the U.S. Corps of Engineers had put a portable bridge across, and the tanks crossed on over. There was a German command post up in a church tower across the river in this village, and they had kept firing away at the tanks, but it was just a matter of a few minutes until one of our tanks took aim on the tower and knocked the top of it off. Needless to say, that silenced this enemy fire that was coming from this church tower. After the tanks crossed the river, we could see a flag on a German swastika on the flagpole in the village square. Within a few minutes, the German swastika was lowered and the American flag was raised, and you can imagine what an experience it was for us to see the American flag flying in what we considered enemy territory. Our military authorities came in and talked to us and told us that for us not to leave the camp because there were German troops in the area. There were lots of sappers, snipers, and we'd run the risk of being killed if we should actually leave the camp. That we should stay there. However, some of the fellows didn't heed this, and some of them took off on their own over the countryside, and I'm sure that many of them were never heard from again. The tanks, as we found out, were a part of the 3rd Armored Division, which is the division that was led by General Patton. By nightfall, the tanks were in Munich, which is some 25 miles from the camp where we were. This gives you an idea of how fast the German tank corps was advancing. In fact, they were so far ahead of the infantry, which was used in mopping up, that we didn't see any of the American infantry until almost dark this particular day. About 3 days after we were liberated, General Patton came in to our camp and spoke to us. And he is the colorful man that you've seen in pictures, in movies. He was wearing his 2 pearl-handled pistols, wearing his riding boots, and with a shiny helmet, and rather an imposing military man. He made a short speech to us and told us how happy he was that his army had the opportunity of liberating us, and that they would do everything they could to expedite our being taken out of Germany and being returned home again. We stayed in the camp some 2 weeks before we actually could be moved, because there were so many other priorities in getting fuel to the tanks, food to the troops, and of course feeding us as well. Because now that we're liberated, we became the responsibility of our own forces to feed us. We were taken to a German airfield that had been put back in order after being bombed and badly damaged by the American Air Force. We were taken to this airfield and flown out in C-47 to a camp in France. It was called Camp Lucky Strike. And when we arrived at the camp in France, we were put on a diet that brought us back more or less to normal living and eating conditions. The first week we were at the camp, we had a very small helping of food. The second week, they increased the helping at each meal, and in the third week, we were allowed to eat all that we wanted. This was to condition our bodies to a normal diet again, because, as I mentioned before, we had lost so much weight and had been on such a skimpy diet for some 3 or 4 months, and this is our medical people decided that would be the best way to return us more or less to a normal diet. After some 3 weeks at Camp Lucky Strike, we went aboard the General William S. Gordon, which is a troop ship in command of the Coast Guard that brought us back to the United States. However, the General Gordon was carrying military Air Force personnel to South America on reassignment, and rather than going directly to New York, we went down into the Caribbean and delivered these troops to Trinidad. I shall never forget when we docked in Trinidad that they had one of these bands that played a serenade for us on the dock. We were not allowed to go ashore because we were prisoners, and the ship commander wanted to make sure that he got us all back safely to New York. I very distinctly remember one of the tunes that they played was Rum and Coca-Cola. A native band that came out to serenade us on the dock while the boat was docked there unloading the Air Force personnel. From there we went to New York, and I shall never forget when we entered New York Harbor and passed the Statue of Liberty. Fireboats and came out to greet us, and there was a boat with a military band on board, and it goes without saying, I don't think there was a man on board this ship who didn't weep openly at the sight of the Statue of Liberty. It was the most beautiful sight in the world to enter New York Harbor and pass the Statue of Liberty on the way into being docked at the pier in New York. In New York, we were taken to Camp Shanks, which it was at that time had been set up as a reception center for returning prisoners of war. From here, we were loaded. They set up special troop trains, and I came back to California. However, I should mention here that we had first-class accommodations all the way from New York to California. Pullman, the best service that one could have. What a contrast from on how we had been treated when we were transported around various places as German POWs. After spending some 30 days on military leave after arriving home in California, I had to go for further medical attention. There were scars on my face that had to be taken care of. Plastic surgery was performed, and I retired from the Air Force on a disability retirement in April of 1946. The injury that I received when we were shot down, I lost the use of my left eye, and it could not be restored because of the ruptured retina. And although plastic surgery did restore me more or less normally as far as features, facial features were concerned, I did lose the use of my eye, and this is the reason that the Air Force saw fit to retire me on disability.